She chose to stay. That line changed his life more than the war did. In the Arizona Territory of 1883, nobody said a captive Apache woman, branded too wild to tame, too proud to break, chose anything at all. But she did. She chose him. And Wyatt Hale, a hollowed-out Civil War veteran who'd come west looking for silence and found a whole different kind of healing, hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected any of it, not her, not what she showed him about this desert he thought he knew, not what she quietly did to the empty place inside him that the war had left behind. What began the morning his foreman rode home with a chained woman and a guilty conscience became the most important story of both their lives. This is that story. Stay with it till the end, and if you've ever needed something wild to remind you what it means to choose your own life, like and subscribe. The Dragoon Mountains rose from the Arizona high desert like broken teeth against a pale sky. It was the fall of 1883, and Wyatt Hale had come west after the war, not to get rich, not to start over, but to find quiet. He hadn't found it yet. Wyatt Hale had been running his cattle spread in the shadow of the dragoons for 6 years by then. And in those 6 years he'd said fewer words than most men said in a week. Neighbors had stopped stopping by. They said he was cold. They said the war had taken whatever was warm in him and left behind a man who worked and slept and woke and worked again, like a machine running on duty and nothing else. They weren't entirely wrong. He'd gone to the war at 19. He'd come home at 23, which didn't sound old, but inside he was somewhere closer to 60. He'd left his younger brother Thomas on a field at Chickamauga, and the letter he'd sent home to their mother had taken 11 days to arrive. She read it and went quiet, and she never really came back from that quiet either. She died the winter Wyatt got home, and he always figured it was grief more than the cold that took her. He'd tried the East. Too loud. He'd tried Missouri. Too many men who wanted to talk about the war. He'd moved west with $80 and a horse and a short list of things he believed in. Hard work, fair dealing, and letting a man be. He built the ranch one fence post at a time. He ran Hereford cattle. He paid his hands fairly and let them go in winter when there wasn't enough work to justify the wages. His foreman, a weathered Mexican named Carlos, who'd been born in the Santa Cruz Valley and knew this country better than the rocks knew each other, had been with him from the second year. Carlos didn't push for conversation. Wyatt appreciated that. The ranch sat at the base of a long, sloping canyon the locals called Coyote Draw. The water table was good. The grass came up green in spring and held for most of the summer, which was better than most places this far south. It was good land. Wyatt had chosen it because it was far enough from the road that you couldn't hear wagons from the porch. That mattered. He hadn't intended to take in a prisoner. He hadn't intended to take in anything. It was Carlos who brought her, though that wasn't entirely accurate either. Carlos had ridden to Benson to collect supplies and mail, and he'd come back with the wagon loaded and his face closed in a way that told Wyatt something had gone wrong before a single word was spoken. "There's a situation," Carlos said. A situation, it turned out, was a woman chained to a post behind Dunmore's trading post on the south end of Benson's main street. Her name, according to the ledger Dunmore kept, was written down as Apache female, acquired Tucson, sold as domestic, $14. She'd been brought in by a man named Calhoun, who ran a loose, ugly sort of operation moving horses' goods, and occasionally people between the Arizona settlements. She was Chiricahua Apache, maybe 20 or 21 years old, and she'd already tried to run twice, which was why Dunmore had chained her. Carlos had seen her on his way past. He'd come back an hour later and found her still there, in the full sun, without water, and there was a cut above her eye where someone had struck her. Carlos was not a man who intervened in things that weren't his business, but he was also not a man who could walk past something like that and sleep. He bought out her contract. He'd used the ranch's supply money to do it, which meant they were short on flour and salt pork for the month. And he'd ridden home with her sitting in the wagon bed as far from him as the wagon would allow, her wrists still marked from the chain, not speaking. Wyatt stood on the porch and looked at Carlos, and then looked at her. "You spent the supply money," Wyatt said. "I did. We'll be eating short this month." "We will." There was a pause. The woman in the wagon bed didn't look at either of them. She sat with her spine very straight, her dark eyes fixed somewhere over Wyatt's left shoulder, her jaw set with a rigidity that was either fury or the effort not to show fear. Probably both. "She speak English?" Wyatt asked. "Some," Carlos said. "She understands more than she lets on, I think." Wyatt looked at her for another long moment. He noticed the cut above her eye. He noticed the marks on her wrists. He noticed the way she held herself, like a person who had decided a long time ago that nothing and no one would make her bend. "She can take the room off the kitchen," he said. "She doesn't have to do anything she doesn't want to do." Carlos translated this. Her language was Athabascan in its roots, a cousin to some of the Navajo words he knew, and he managed the general shape of it, if not the precise phrasing. The woman's eyes moved to Wyatt then, just briefly, and there was something in them that wasn't gratitude exactly. It was more like assessment, like she was deciding whether to believe him. She didn't say anything. She didn't say anything for 3 days. Her name was Sayen. Carlos learned it on the second day from a word she murmured to herself when she thought no one was listening. He told Wyatt quietly, and Wyatt filed it away without comment. She ate. That was something. On the first morning, Wyatt left a plate of beans and cornbread outside the kitchen door, not wanting to push, and it was gone by midday. He did the same the second morning. On the third morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table when he came in before dawn to put the coffee on, and she watched him work the stove with those measuring eyes. And when he put a second cup of coffee on the table, she wrapped both hands around it and drank it without acknowledgment and without thanks. He didn't need thanks. He put coffee on the table because there was no reason not to. The cut above her eye was healing. She'd cleaned it herself with something from a small pouch she wore at her belt, a mix of dried herbs that smelled sharp and medicinal, better than anything the ranch kept in its first aid tin. He noticed, but didn't comment. Carlos told him what he'd been able to piece together over those first few days, in fragments and inference and the occasional direct phrase. Her name, Sayen, was a name that meant one who blooms, or something close to that, a hopeful name for a hard world. She was Chiricahua, from the band that had ranged these mountains before the army's pressure had pushed them further and further into smaller territory. She'd been separated from her people in circumstances Carlos couldn't quite clarify. There'd been a raid, a relocation, soldiers, the kind of chaos that the last decade of Apache wars had made ordinary. She'd been alone for some time before Calhoun had found her. She hadn't been treated well. Carlos left the details vague, and Wyatt didn't press him. The cut above her eye was not the only mark on her, but the others weren't his to look at or to comment on. What he knew was this: she was not broken. Whatever had happened to her, she had not been broken. She moved through the ranch with a self-possession that was not arrogance exactly. It was something older than arrogance, something closer to a person who had decided that her dignity was the one thing no one else got to decide about. Wyatt respected that. He didn't quite know what to do with it, but he respected it. The first conversation that was actually a conversation happened on the fourth morning. He was out at the corral before sunrise, checking on a yearling heifer that had been slow to get up the day before. And when he turned around, Sayen was standing at the fence, watching the horses in the adjacent paddock. He had 8 horses, 4 working stock, 2 for driving the supply wagon, and 2 that were his own personal animals. One, an old gray he'd ridden for 5 years, the other a young sorrel mare with a bad habit of throwing her head that he'd been working on all summer. The sorrel was standing at the far side of the paddock, watching Sayen with her ears forward. "That one," Sayen said. Wyatt turned to look at her. It was the first full sentence in English he'd heard from her, unprompted. "What about her?" he said. "She's not mean," Sayen said. "She's afraid." Wyatt looked at the sorrel. He'd been thinking the same thing for weeks, actually, that the head-throwing wasn't bad manners but something more like anxiety, some old fear that got triggered by certain angles of approach, or certain sounds. He hadn't said it out loud because there was no one on the ranch who'd have found it interesting. "Yeah," he said, "I think you're right." Sayen looked at him then, that same measuring look, and this time it lasted a little longer before she looked away. That was the beginning of it. Not dramatic, just 2 people standing at a fence in the early dark, agreeing about a horse. She didn't warm to him fast. That would be the wrong word for what happened. It was more like the distance between them shifted slowly, the way ice at the edge of a river softens before the main thaw. She was in the kitchen most mornings when he came in. She'd started without comment, making a second cup of coffee without being asked. She knew where things were kept now, the flour, the good salt, the tin of lard. She'd made fry bread one morning, the kind with a little sweetness to it, using blue corn she'd asked Carlos to bring from the trading post in town, and it was the best thing Wyatt had eaten in years, though he only said it was good, which was the most he said about any food. She began going out to the Sorrel Mare in the evenings. Wyatt watched from the porch the first few times, not intrusively, just keeping an eye in case the horse was difficult. But the horse was not difficult with her. Sayen would stand at the paddock fence for a while, just being there, not reaching, not pushing, until the mare came to her of her own choosing. Then she'd let the horse smell her hand, her hair, her sleeve. She talked to the horse in Apache, low and even, and the sorrel's head came down and her breathing slowed. He'd been trying to gentle that horse for 4 months. Sayen had done it in a week. On the 10th day he went out to the paddock and found her on the mare's bare back, no saddle, just her weight and her hands on the mane, walking the horse in slow circles. She was not showing off. She was just riding, the way some people are just riding and some people are something else entirely, something older, something that looks like the rider and the horse are telling each other the same story. He'd never seen anything like it. She saw him watching and didn't change anything. Didn't stop, didn't perform for him, didn't look embarrassed. Just kept riding until she was ready to stop, then slid down and led the mare to the water trough and let her drink. "She's a good horse," Sayen said. "She is," Wyatt agreed. She just needed someone to listen. Sayen looked at him. There was something different in her face in that moment, some small shift he couldn't quite name. She turned back to the horse without answering. Carlos noticed, of course. Carlos noticed everything and said very little about what he noticed, which was one of the things Wyatt valued about him. But one evening near the end of Sayen's second week at the ranch, when they were working on a broken section of fence near the east pasture, and the light was going gold in the west, Carlos said, almost as an aside, "She's healing." "I know," Wyatt said. "So are you," Carlos said. He didn't say anything to that. Carlos didn't seem to need him to. The ranch had a rhythm and Sayen found her place in it. She wasn't a servant, Wyatt had been clear about that, or as clear as a man who didn't use many words could be. She helped when she wanted to and sat when she didn't, and nobody made her account for her time. But she chose to help, more and more. She helped with the horses in a way that was genuinely useful, better than anything he could have paid for. She helped in the kitchen. She went with Carlos one afternoon to check on a cow that had been slow to come to water, and she diagnosed a shoulder abscess that the cow had been hiding, the way cattle sometimes do, and she knew what to pack it with from the desert plants around the draw. Carlos, who had spent 20 years learning this desert, was impressed. He told Wyatt that evening that some of what Sayen knew about plants and animals came from her mother, who had been a healer of the sort that held real knowledge, not the kind you could look up in a book, but the kind that got passed from one person to another over generations. "Where is her mother now?" Wyatt asked. Carlos's face went flat. "She's not sure. After the last removal, she lost track." Wyatt didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The government's handling of the Apache in the last decade had been a catastrophe by any honest accounting, and he knew it, and knowing it didn't change any of it. He thought about Sayen that night, lying in his bunk with the desert wind moving across the eaves. He thought about her mother, somewhere, not knowing where her daughter was. He thought about his own mother who'd gotten a letter and gone quiet and not come back. He thought about the things that disappeared from a person and left a hole. And he thought that maybe that was what he'd recognized in Sayen from the beginning, the shape of a hole that resembled his own. He didn't dwell on this long. Wyatt was not a man who dwelled, but he noted it. In her 3rd week, she taught him a word, just one, and only because it was relevant. They were working in the kitchen together. She had taken to showing him, without making a lesson out of it, how she made certain things, and she handed him a root she'd dug from the slope behind the barn, a thing he'd never seen used before. And when he turned it over in his hands, not knowing what he was looking at, She said a word in Apache and then looked at him. He tried to say it back. He got it wrong in a way that must have been comical because she didn't quite laugh. She was not quite ready to laugh. But something moved in her face that was in the neighborhood of amusement. He tried again, closer. She nodded, very small. He filed the word away. He used it correctly 3 days later when he saw the same root growing at the edge of the east pasture. And she heard him say it and stopped and looked at him with something he could only call surprised respect. It was a small thing. It meant something anyway. By the 4th week he had 5 words, and she had more English than she showed most people. He figured that out gradually. She understood more than she let on, and what she chose not to understand was usually something she decided wasn't worth acknowledging. He respected the strategy. He'd spent years doing something similar. One afternoon she showed him something he'd never seen before. She'd been out along the creek bed behind the far pasture, the dry wash that only ran in heavy rain, and she came back with a handful of things he couldn't identify: a dark root, some dried seed pods, a piece of lichen from a shaded rock face. She spread them on the kitchen table and arranged them without comment, and then she began showing him what each one was for, using a mix of Apache words and slow English, and the occasional gesture when both languages failed her. The root was for drawing heat out of a deep wound. The seed pods, crushed and steeped in hot water, helped a person sleep without nightmares. The lichen, made into a paste, was good for dry skin in the cold months. He didn't write any of this down. He didn't need to. He'd learned young that you held important things in your mind, not on paper, because paper could burn. She watched him watching her and seemed satisfied. "Your hands," she said, nodding toward the scar across his left palm. "An old one from a cavalry accident." He held it out, not thinking about it. She took his hand and turned it over and looked at the scar for a moment, then let go. He held very still through all of this, because he'd understood from the first day that she moved on her own terms, and sudden movements would mean something different to her than they would to a woman who had not been through what she had. "Old?" she asked. 14 years, he said. She nodded and went back to sorting her plants. He stood there for a moment with his hand at his side, feeling the ghost of being touched, which was not a feeling he'd had in some time. There was one morning in that 4th week when he came in from an early ride and found her asleep in the kitchen chair. She'd been up late. He'd heard her moving around past midnight, and she'd fallen asleep sitting up, the way people do when they're too tired to walk to bed. She was curled slightly forward, her braid over one shoulder, her hands loose in her lap. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, unguarded. The controlled composure she carried like armor was just gone, and what was underneath it was a young woman who was exhausted. He put more wood on the fire so the kitchen would stay warm, set the coffee water onto heat, and went back outside without waking her. He did it quietly, which was its own kind of care. When she came out to the yard an hour later, she didn't say anything about the warm kitchen or the coffee waiting on the stove. She just handed him a cup and went to check on the horses. He noticed she'd slept an extra 2 hours after that. October was a good month in the Dragoon country, dry and clear, the heat of summer finally bleeding out of the rocks. The cattle were fat from the summer grass, and the sorting would come in November. He worked long days, and she worked alongside the ranch in her own rhythm. Not his schedule, not Carlos's, but something that seemed to fit naturally around the ranch's needs the way water fits its bed. There was a morning she climbed onto the south-facing ridge behind the barn before he was up, and came back with 4 quail she'd taken with a snare, which was more efficient hunting than he'd managed all month. They ate well that week. Carlos, who cooked when there was nobody else to do it and did it adequately, stopped cooking that month. Nobody officially discussed this transition. It just became the way things were. Sayen cooked, and the food was remarkable, not because she used exotic ingredients, but because she knew this desert's pantry in a way he never had. Dried wild onions, mesquite bean flour mixed into the cornbread, agave syrup in the coffee on cold mornings. The food tasted like the land they were standing on, which was something he hadn't known he was missing until he tasted it. One evening Carlos mentioned, in passing, that in the Chiricahua tradition, it was believed that the land fed you better when you knew its name for things, that you ate differently when you understood what you were eating. He didn't know if Sayen had said this to him directly, or if he'd picked it up from watching her work, but the idea stayed in Wyatt's mind for days. He'd been eating the same food for 6 years. He'd never tasted the land in it before. The external world intruded in late October, which was when Wyatt had expected it to. He'd been into Benson twice since bringing Sayen out to the ranch, for supply runs and to pick up the mail, and both times he'd felt the temperature of the town shift when people got a look at his wagon. News moved fast in small settlements. The kind of news that moved fastest was the wrong kind. He'd heard the whisper twice, once from the man who ran the feed store and once from a woman outside the dry goods merchant, about the rancher out in Coyote Draw who'd taken in one of the Apache women. The word that got attached to this story varied, but none of the versions were kind. He ignored it. He'd been ignoring what people said about him for years. It was not difficult. What was harder to ignore was when Dunmore himself rode out to the ranch on a Thursday in the last week of October, with a man Wyatt didn't know riding beside him. Dunmore ran the trading post where Carlos had found Sayen. He was a man of middle height and a great deal of self-assurance, the kind that wasn't backed up by much when you looked at it closely, but that a certain sort of man carried so far forward that people got out of the way without examining it. The man beside him was named Calhoun, which was a name Wyatt had heard before in the context of what had been done to Sayen's wrists. Wyatt met them in the yard. "Hale," Dunmore said. "I'll make this brief. The woman your man bought out of my establishment was Calhoun's property, legally acquired. Your man had no right to use your ranch's funds to purchase a contract that was already spoken for. There's a matter of compensation owed." Wyatt looked at Dunmore. He looked at Calhoun. He looked back at Dunmore. "She's not property," he said. "Federal law? Federal law on this question is complicated, and you know it," Wyatt said. "And the Army's been moving faster than the courts in this territory for 10 years, so I'd be careful about what you claim is settled. She came here willingly. She stays willingly. You want to explain to me what your legal claim is on a person who came willingly." There was a silence. Calhoun's hand moved toward his belt. Wyatt saw it, and his own hand moved faster than thought, 20 years old in reflex if not in heart, and he didn't pull his revolver, but he put his hand on it, and both men on horseback read the situation clearly enough. "This isn't over," Calhoun said. "It is for today," Wyatt said. "Ride out." They rode out. Wyatt stood in the yard until they were far enough down the canyon that the dust was all he could see, and then he turned around and found Sayen standing at the corner of the barn. She'd seen all of it. Her face was controlled in that way. She had that unbreakable control she wore the way other people wore hats. But her hands, he noticed, had relaxed. They'd been tight at her sides, and now they were just hands at her sides. "You should know," he said, "that this probably isn't over. Men like that don't let things go easy." "I know men like that," she said. "I know you do. I'm telling you I'm not going to let them take you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Why?" It was a fair question. He thought about it. He could have said the obvious thing, the decent thing, the right thing. But she wasn't asking about decency. She was asking something more specific, because nobody has the right to own a person, he said. "I've seen what men do when they believe they own people. I fought in a war over it, and I am not interested in spending the rest of my life pretending I didn't learn anything." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded just once and walked back into the barn. He stood there alone in the yard and noticed distantly that something in his chest had loosened slightly, something that had been clenched for a long time. Carlos rode into town the following morning to get a read on the situation, and what he came back with was not encouraging. Calhoun had spent the evening at the saloon talking, and what he'd been saying was that Wyatt Hale had stolen from him, that there was a legal matter to be settled, and that he intended to settle it. Some of the town's less admirable element had been listening with interest. There were 3 names attached to Calhoun's plan now, which made it less of a grievance and more of an operation. Wyatt listened to all of this, and then sent a rider to his nearest neighbor, a man named Fitch who ran a cattle operation 6 miles north, and who was, unlike most people, reliably reasonable. He also told Sayen. He told her directly and with full information, because he decided he owed her that. She was not a child to be protected from what was happening. This was her situation as much as his, and she had the right to know it. He also told her something else, something he hadn't told many people and didn't tell easily. "I know what it is to be in a place because you have nowhere else to go," he said. "But you're not here because you have nowhere else. I want you to know that. You could walk out of here tomorrow, take one of the horses, and I'd let you go. I'd give you supplies and a direction, and I wouldn't say a word about it." She looked at him steadily. "So you're saying I'm choosing this," she said. "You always were," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I knew that." There was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. She listened to the situation about Calhoun carefully, the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting. When he was done, she asked 2 questions. "How many men and when?" 3, maybe 4, he said. "Carlos thinks they'll wait until the weekend when there are fewer people watching the road." "Then we have 4 days, she said. "We do. I know some things about this country that you don't," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was just a fact, offered plainly. "I know you do," he said. "If you'll listen," she said. "I'm listening," he said. And that was how they sat down at the kitchen table, the taciturn Civil War veteran rancher and the proud Chiricahua woman who had every reason in the world to trust no man living, and made a plan together. What Sayen knew about the Coyote Draw country went beyond what you could learn by riding it. She'd grown up moving through the Dragoon Range and the country around it, and she knew where a small group of riders coming from Benson would have to slow down, knew what sight lines were good and which ridge lines gave away your position against the sky, knew where water was and where it wasn't. She knew things about patience, too, about waiting and watching rather than meeting trouble head-on. Wyatt knew different things. He knew defensive positions and fields of fire, and the psychology of men who thought they were outnumbering someone. He knew when a situation would fight, and when it would fold. Together, they knew enough. They sent Carlos to Fitch with a note explaining the situation. Fitch, who was a fair-minded man and who'd had his own difficulties with Calhoun's type in the past, agreed to ride over with 2 of his hands on the morning they expected trouble. Not to fight, just to witness. Men like Calhoun, Wyatt had learned, lost a great deal of their certainty when they realized more people were watching than they'd planned for. The preparation took 2 days. Sayen showed Wyatt 3 places in the draw where a watchman could sit without being seen from the road. Wyatt reinforced the barn lock and moved the horses to the east paddock, behind the barn where they couldn't be spooked or taken quietly. He kept his rifle oiled and loaded and within reach. On the 3rd night, Sayen couldn't sleep, and neither could he, and they sat at the kitchen table after midnight with coffee between them and the lamp turned low. The silence that night was different from the silences of the first week. The first week's silence had been the silences of strangers who didn't know how to be in the same room. This was something else, the silence of 2 people who were genuinely comfortable not speaking, which is its own kind of closeness. "What was your brother's name?" she asked. He looked up at her. He hadn't expected the question. She must have heard Carlos mention Thomas at some point, though he couldn't remember when. "Thomas," he said. "Were you close?" "Very." She nodded. She turned her cup in her hands. "I had a sister," she said, 2 years younger. She was better at almost everything, faster, funnier, better with horses. A pause. "I lost track of her during the relocation. I don't know where she went." He didn't say he was sorry. She wasn't looking for that. He just sat with it. "I know that feeling," he said. "Not knowing. It's worse than knowing," she said. "Knowing, you can grieve. Not knowing, you just keep looking for them in every face." He understood that completely. They sat there until the lamp burned low and the coffee went cold. And at some point the conversation became comfortable quiet again. And the quiet became something he didn't want to leave. He hadn't not wanted to leave a room in years. He hadn't wanted to stay anywhere in a long time. He thought, that's interesting. He left it at that because he was not a man who built structures on half-formed things. But he noted it. Calhoun and his men came on Saturday, which was when Carlos had predicted. There were 4 of them. They came at mid-morning, which was bolder than Wyatt had expected. Men doing something they knew was wrong usually came under cover of dark. The boldness told him something about how thoroughly Calhoun had convinced himself that he was in the right. Wyatt was at the gate when they arrived. Carlos stood to his left. Sayen was behind and to the right of the barn, Wyatt's idea had been for her to stay inside. Her idea had been that she was not a person who hid while other people fought over her, and they had settled on a compromise position. Fitch and his 2 hands were up on the ridge to the east, where a man riding up the canyon would have to look hard to see them, but where they could see everything. Calhoun pulled up his horse at the gate. "Hale," he said. "Calhoun," Wyatt said. "I'm here for what's mine." "There's nothing of yours here," Wyatt said. Carlos paid for a contract. The terms of that contract were satisfied. The woman is free. She stays here by her own choosing. "You had no right. We can argue about rights," Wyatt said. "Or you can turn your horses around. I'd recommend the second option. You've got 4 men. I've got 2 good rifles and Fitch up on that ridge with 2 more. And unlike you, we're standing on land we've got a clean claim to." He paused. "How this goes from here is your decision." Calhoun looked at him. He looked at the ridge. He found Fitch up there, which wasn't hard once you were looking. His face did several things in quick succession. The man to Calhoun's left said something quiet, and Calhoun's jaw tightened. "This isn't the last of it," Calhoun said. "It might not be," Wyatt said, "but it's the end of it today." Calhoun pulled his horse's head around. His men followed. They rode back down the canyon and didn't look back. Wyatt stood at the gate until they were gone. The dust from their horses settled slowly in the still air. He noticed his own hands then, steady, because the war had trained that into him so deep it was permanent now. But there was something behind the steadiness that wasn't quite calm. He had faced worse, objectively. He'd been in worse positions with worse odds and less warning. But this had felt different, because this wasn't about him. That was new. He turned and looked at Sayen, who was standing outside the barn with her arms at her sides and her chin up. "They'll come back?" she said. "Maybe," he said. "But word gets around. Fitch will make sure people know he was here. Men like Calhoun run on the assumption that no one's watching. Take that away, and they tend to look for easier targets." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, without making a production of it. "You'd have done the same," he said. She looked at him. Something in her face had shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way things shift when a door that's been stuck for a long time finally moves in its frame. Fitch came down from the ridge and had coffee with them on the porch, and he was decent and plain-spoken and treated Sayen the way you'd treat any person at your host's table, which cost him nothing and meant something. He left before noon. Carlos watched him go and then looked at Wyatt and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. November came and the mornings got cold. The first real chill off the dragoons came in the first week of the month. Frost on the grass by dawn, the air clean and sharp in a way that made everything feel more real. Sayen had started wearing a blanket around her shoulders in the mornings, a heavy one from the chest at the end of the hallway that she'd found and claimed without asking, which was fine. He'd have given it to her if she'd asked, but he was glad she'd just taken it. It meant she was settling. The Sorrel mare had a name now. Sayen had given her one, a word in Apache that Carlos translated as something like "finds her own way," which seemed exactly right for that horse. Wyatt started using it, his pronunciation getting cleaner with practice, and Sayen corrected him when he got it wrong without making him feel bad about it, which was its own kind of teaching. He was learning things from her all the time, not just words, though the words added up. He had 20 or 30 now, functional ones, real ones, not the handful of touristic phrases some men learned to seem interesting at dinner parties. He was learning things about this land he'd lived in for 6 years and had never understood the way she understood it. She showed him where the desert willow grew in the dry creek beds, where the plants that could treat fever grew on the north-facing slopes, where the deer came to water in the early mornings at a seep he'd ridden past 100 times without stopping. She showed him how to read the sky before a thunderstorm that the barometer in the house couldn't predict yet, a specific quality of light, a particular smell in the air, the way certain birds went quiet. She also showed him things that were harder to put into words, the way she moved through a space, any space, inside or out, with a complete and particular awareness of everything in it. She never stood with her back to a door. She always knew where each person on the ranch was at any given time, not by watching them directly, but by some broader attention that took in the whole picture. He recognized it because he had something like it himself, the war-trained habit of situational awareness that didn't turn off when the fighting stopped. But hers was older than that and more refined, and it came without the weight his carried. One morning he watched her read a set of tracks on the slope behind the barn. 4 kinds of animal, the direction of travel, the time of day, what each had been doing with the same matter-of-fact accuracy a bookkeeper might read a ledger. She wasn't performing. She was just seeing clearly. "Your people teach this?" he asked. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "She said the land tells you everything you need to know if you bother to listen." He thought about that a lot in the weeks after she said it. He showed her things, too. He taught her to read the ranch's ledger books, because she'd shown interest and because it seemed wrong not to. He taught her how the cattle were sorted and why, what the prices were and how they moved, what the difference was between a good year and a bad one in this business. She was quick with numbers, quicker than he was, and she caught the pattern in 3 years of ledger data after looking at it for a short while, and asked a question about pricing cycles that he'd been wondering about for 2 seasons, without quite formulating into a question. He showed her the rifle, too, because she asked. Not to be dangerous, she knew a great deal already about being dangerous, and it wasn't in a way that made him uneasy. It was just competence, the kind a woman needed out here. He showed her the mechanics, and she handled the gun with the careful respect of someone who understood what it was, and after an hour she was shooting accurately enough to matter. "My father taught me to shoot a bow," she said. "Is that better?" he asked. She considered this. "Quieter," she said. He laughed. It came out before he could stop it, a real laugh, a short one, but actual and unguarded. She looked at him when he laughed with a look he couldn't quite read, and then she looked away and there was just the hint of something at the corner of her mouth. Carlos told him later that week, very quietly, that it was the first time he'd heard Wyatt laugh in 3 years. Wyatt told him to mind his own business. Carlos nodded agreeably and did not change his expression. What happened over those November weeks was not simple. And it was not fast. There was no single moment when the distance between them crossed into something else. It was more like a season changing, where you can't point to the day and say, "Here, this is when autumn became winter." It just did, and one day you looked up and saw the frost on the ground and knew something had shifted. He thought about her more than was comfortable. He noticed her in the kitchen in the mornings, her hands moving efficiently over whatever she was making, the blanket around her shoulders, the loose dark braid falling to one side. He noticed the way she moved through the corral with the horses, that particular quality of stillness she had around them. He noticed that she'd started leaving his coffee ready when she heard him moving in the back room, before he'd even come out to make it himself. He was not a man who told himself comfortable lies about what he was feeling. He knew what he was feeling. He also knew that he wasn't the kind of man who would act on it without a great deal more certainty than he had. And he was also not sure that what she felt was the same thing. And he was also worried that given what she'd been through, the last thing she needed was another man deciding he had a claim on her. He turned this over in his head on the long November nights, and mostly came to the same conclusion. Just keep being decent. Just be what you are. Let her be what she is. Don't push. She pushed first. Or not pushed, exactly. That wasn't the right word. But she was the one who said the thing. They were at the corral on a late November afternoon, the sun going low and orange behind the dragoons, the temperature dropping fast, both of them watching the Sorrel mare move around the paddock in that easy, unfussed way she had now. The silence between them was easy, the good kind. "I've been thinking," Sayen said. "About?" he said. He went very still. "There are people to the south who might know where my sister is," she said. "When spring comes, I could go and look. That makes sense?" he said. She was quiet. Then she said, "I could also come back." He looked at her. "If I found nothing," she said, "or if I found what I needed to find, I could come back here." She was looking at the horse, not at him. Her profile was steady, that same composed steadiness she always carried. But there was something in her voice that he recognized. The particular flatness of someone saying something that matters to them, and not wanting it to show how much. "You'd be welcome," he said. "You'd be more than welcome." She turned and looked at him then, just looked, directly, the way she sometimes looked at the horses when she was deciding whether they were ready. "You're a strange man," she said. "I've heard that," he said. "You don't try to own anything," she said. "Not me, not the land, you just live here." "I try," he said. She looked back at the horse. The orange light had caught on the side of her face, and the dark braid at her shoulder, and he thought she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life, and he thought it simply, without drama, the way you note a fact. "I'll look for my sister," she said. "But I'll come back. I'll be here," he said. Fitch came by the following week and mentioned, with the particular casualness men used when they were actually saying something direct, that the word around Benson was that Calhoun had left the territory, moved to New Mexico, apparently, to do whatever it was he did there. Nobody seemed to miss him. Wyatt received this information without visible reaction, and thanked Fitch for the update. Sayen, who was in the kitchen but had clearly heard, came out onto the porch when Fitch left and stood beside Wyatt looking out at the draw. "Good," she said. "Yeah," he said. December came and they put up against the cold together, which was its own kind of intimacy. He brought in more wood and she made sure there was always something warm to eat, and neither of them commented on the fact that the kitchen had become a place they both occupied in the evenings now, reading or working on small repairs, or just sitting by the stove while the wind moved outside. The ranch was quieter in winter, the hands down to just Carlos and one boy named Delgado, who was learning the cattle work. But the ranch house was less quiet than it had been, and Wyatt found he didn't mind that at all. She taught him more Apache. He got better at it. The words became sentences, slow and imperfect, but real. One evening she said something to him in Apache that was long enough to be a sentence he hadn't heard before, and he got most of it but not all. And when he asked her to say it again slowly, she did, and when he finally understood it, he sat with it for a moment before answering. What she'd said was, "You see things clearly, for a man who isn't looking." He thought about that for a long time after. He thought about what it would mean for her to go south in spring and search for her sister and find nothing, or find something, and then choose to come back. He thought about what he would do if she came back. He thought about what it would mean if she didn't. He thought about a life that had more in it than silence and work and the slow passage of seasons alone. He thought, with some surprise, that he wanted that, not desperately, not with the ache of a man who'd been lonely so long he'd take anything, but genuinely. He wanted it the way you want something you've decided is worth wanting. The winter got deep enough that travel wasn't practical until March. Sayen made her preparations quietly over February, repacking the small bundle she'd arrived with, asking Carlos to help her send word south through some intermediary channels she knew, gathering provisions for a longer journey. She did this without fanfare and without drama, and without looking at Wyatt in a way that asked him to stop her. He didn't try to stop her. He helped. He brought the Sorrel mare to her the morning she was leaving. The mare, wearing the light hackamore Sayen, had made herself from rope and worked leather over the winter. And Sayen looked at him and then at the horse. "She's yours," he said. "You trained her. Take her." Sayen put her hand on the mare's neck and held it there. "I'll bring her back with me," she said. "I know," he said. She swung up onto the mare's bare back. She rarely used a saddle anymore, had tried his once out of curiosity and decided the Apache way felt truer to her, and the mare had her own opinion about saddles anyway. She sat there in the thin March light, her dark eyes on him, and he held the mare's nose briefly and looked up at her. "You know the way south," he said. "I know every way," she said. He almost said something. He got close to saying something, but she could see that he was close to it. He could tell she could see it, and she looked at him with something that was unmistakably warmth. "I'll come back, Wyatt," she said. The first time she'd used his name, he noticed it and knew she'd done it deliberately. He stepped back from the mare. "I'll be here," he said. She turned the horse and rode. He watched her until the draw curved and she was gone. Carlos came and stood beside him. He didn't say anything, which was the right call. Wyatt stood there a while longer, looking at the place where the draw curved. He felt something. Not loss exactly, though there was some of that. More like the feeling that comes when you realize you have something to wait for, which was a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Having something to wait for was different from just marking time. Marking time was what the years since the war had been. This was different. She was gone for 6 weeks. He worked the ranch. He repaired the south fence and reorganized the supply room and helped a neighbor pull calves through a difficult spring week. He wrote one letter to a man he knew in Tucson who had some connections to the Apache community there, asking if there was any record of displacement from Sayen's band, any word of a younger woman. He didn't know if the letter would help. He sent it anyway. Carlos watched him with a neutral face and did not comment on the fact that Wyatt was working at twice his normal pace, which was the clearest sign of agitation that Wyatt was capable of producing. She came back on a Thursday in late April, in the afternoon, when Wyatt was out at the east pasture marking cattle for summer sorting. He heard the hoofbeats before he saw her, the particular rhythm of the Sorrel mare's trot, which he'd gotten to know well over the winter. He turned. She came up the draw at a steady canter, the mare moving loose and easy, her own bearing exactly what it had always been, straight, composed, that unbreakable quality. She pulled up a few feet away and looked at him. "I found her," she said. He let that land. "Is she well?" he said. "She is." A pause. "She's with good people. She chose to stay where she is." Another pause, her eyes holding his. "I explained to her where I was going." "What did she say?" he asked. The corner of her mouth moved. The same, almost, not quite a smile he'd come to know well. "She said she always knew I'd find somewhere to bloom," Sayen said. "She said our mother was right after all." He stood there in the afternoon light of the east pasture, the cattle moving slowly behind him, the mountains tall and blue in the west, and he thought, you don't get too many days that feel like the beginning of something good. When they come, you should notice them. "I'm glad you're back," he said. It wasn't much, but he meant it completely, and she knew it. She swung down from the mare and stood in front of him and looked at him. "I had 6 weeks to think," she said. "What did you think?" he said. "I thought," she said, "that you are the first man I have known who gave without taking, who left a door open and didn't stand in front of it." She paused. "I thought about what that meant. About what kind of man does that?" He didn't say anything. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have places I could go. I'm choosing this place." She looked at him steadily. "I'm choosing you." There was a long silence, the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. "I'd like that," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. She stepped forward and took his hand. Just that, her hand in his, standing in the spring afternoon in the east pasture with the mountains at their backs. Simple and solid and exactly right. Carlos, who was on the far side of the pasture and had clearly seen all of this, was looking elsewhere with great interest. They were married in June on the ranch, a simple ceremony that Carlos witnessed and that Fitch and his wife rode over for, which made it exactly the right size. The preacher from Benson was a decent man who kept it short and didn't say anything foolish. Afterward, standing on the porch in the evening light, the dragoons going purple in the dusk, Sayen leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the draw, and Wyatt stood beside her, and the silence was the silence of two people who had both been hollowed out by the world and had found, against all reasonable expectation, that the hollow places fit together. He put his hand over hers on the doorframe railing. "We never did figure out how to break you," he said. She smiled. A real one, full, the kind he'd seen more and more in the last months. "No," she said. "You figured out you didn't have to." The desert night came down over Coyote Draw, cool and deep, filled with the particular stillness of a place that has been old for a long time. The stars came out one by one over the dragoons. The sorrel mare moved quietly in the paddock. The ranch was not silent anymore. It was settled. That was enough. For two people who had spent a long time looking for enough, it was considerably more than that. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. There's more where that came from every week.